life cycle lectures. In it, we're going to look at physical developments, cognitive developments, and social developments that we see in adolescence, which is a very important transition time period for a person's development, as it is the transition from childhood to adulthood. We're going to look at social development first. One of the biggest things that we see in adolescence is the development of an identity. An identity can include how a person associates themselves and what kind of individual they find themselves to be. Often outward appearance, because of its connection to other people and how other people react to it, outward appearance is a big part of someone's identity. In early adolescence, developing one's own identity is very, very crucial and one of the most important things of adolescence. You see this a lot in middle school or in early high school, people changing their hair color. They might get a piercing. They might go through an emo phase or something like that. All of which because they're experimenting on who they are. Another way that a person begins to identify with who they are, develop their own identity, is the development of a social identity. And this social identity is the identity that's created by being included in a social group. So like the plastics from Mean Girls that you see here, or whether it's jocks or nerds or other sort of labels that we might give social groups. Those social groups help an adolescent create a social identity. Not only do they have their own definition of themselves, but also what type of person, what group they fit into as well. Intimacy is something that happens at much higher frequencies in the romantic sense during adolescence. This is where people begin to really develop intimate relationships. And while people may have had close friendships that were intimate, intimate relationships can take it a step further because now it's not someone who they worked on developing a friendship with, but now an adolescent might really go forward and begin to open themselves up and really begin to connect and partner with another person. Parent relationships are, well, challenging at some points in adolescence. Often parents and children go through some significant changes to their relationships. By the end of adolescence, many parents begin to view their children as adults. But getting there is difficult, and it's difficult for parents to let go of the fact that that adolescents are no longer children. And sometimes this creates conflict. Although there's no specific numbers, what we tend to see is that relationships with the opposite gendered parent during adolescence is a bit more frequent. And just speculation, it might have to do with the fact that parents of the same gender have gone through similar experiences and are trying to tell their children what to do, whereas parents of the opposite gender who haven't gone through some of those same experiences may be more open-minded and welcoming to the choices that their adolescent children make. Peer relationships are key during adolescence. It's during this time that peer relationships take ultimate priority because of their connection to one's identity and one's social identity. So the peer relationships are very important and really allow a person to develop their own sense of community. Whereas when you're a kid, your sense of community is often tied to the classes that you're in or the friends and families that you have. In terms of mental development, morality is the biggest thing that we see during adolescence. Although, as Piaget says, we can develop morality in an earlier stage, in pre-adolescence, in kind of that stage 4 of what he calls. It's not until we get to adolescence that morality really begins to kick in. And this is where a person really begins to develop their own personal sense of right and wrong. Whereas before, morality may have more to do with what their parents are telling them or what society is telling them. By adolescence, people have moved into the 5th and 6th stages of Kohlberg, which is more personal ideas of right and wrong, where there might be exceptions to laws because it's not right for somebody to go through some experience, where maybe breaking the rules is a better idea, where and adolescents really at this time begin to develop empathy, where they can really put themselves in another person's place, and say, this is wrong because if I were here, I wouldn't want to experience it either. A lot of times, this idea of right and wrong creates what we call moral feeling. Moral feeling is when our sense of right and wrong affects us physically. So when we see something so wrong that it makes us sick to our stomach, or so right that it gives us those warm and fuzzy feelings inside. Oftentimes, moral feeling in early adolescence doesn't get acted upon, though, because the social part of adolescence becomes a higher priority than the morality portion. So when I taught middle school, for example, a number of times students would say, like, that's just not right. And I'd say, what did you do about it? They said, well, nothing, because I didn't want other people to think I was unusual or weird or things like that. But by the end of adolescence, people are much more willing to take moral action. And this is when they stand up for things that they find to be right or stand against things that they find to be wrong. This can be done in a personal sense, like standing up to a bully, and can even be done on a much more large scale sense, where a person may begin to join organizations that protest against certain actions that they see as wrong, or protest for other actions that they see as right. In terms of physical development, the biggest thing that we see is hormonal growth during puberty. Uh, During this time, adolescents go through puberty and they become sexually mature. With that comes a abnormal amount of hormone release, and this can cause, as we know, because hormones certainly affect our emotional state, this can cause some emotional instability. Along with that, we're going to hit the third bullet point right now. The limbic system, the part of the brain that's centered around emotions, is still developing until about age 21. So when you combine the hormonal imbalance created by puberty along with a still developing limbic system, it's a big reason why many adolescents are somewhat emotionally unstable, though that goes away once the hormone levels become more stable and when the limbic system fully develops. Finally, the frontal lobe of the brain doesn't develop until about 25. Because of this, our ability to evaluate consequences and perform proper judgments is affected during adolescence. Oftentimes, you might hear parents say to their adolescent children, what were you thinking? Didn't you know it was going to happen? Well, maybe you did, but your frontal lobe may not have allowed you to evaluate the consequences as well as it should have, which may have caused you to make a poor judgment and a wrong decision. These are the big physical changes, along with the normal growth that we see from puberty, which we talked about earlier in the year. These are the major physical changes that is experienced during adolescence. Finally, the last thing is that our neural networks begin to decay during adolescence. The peak time for neural networks is about 8 or 9 years old, when we can really develop skills very, very quickly. But once we pass those ages, especially once we get into adolescence, if we have a neural network for a certain behavior or for certain ideas, but we don't exercise that neural network, we may see the neurons prune themselves, meaning that the network begins to decay and the connections between those neurons also begins to dissipate. So really goes with the phrase, like, if you don't use it, you lose it, which really goes to show why people sometimes may have developed a skill during childhood, but then once they got to adulthood or even adolescence, they stop doing that skill. And when they try to do it again, they're not very good because their neural network has been pruned and decayed. And ultimately, it's really only those behaviors that we continue with that where the neural networks continue to build and grow. That's the end of this lecture. It's a short one. The third lecture that we're going to see will be on adulthood and the elderly stage, which is another one of the lectures for this week.